and basically the home front. Thank you, Leslie. Leslie. All right. Okay. So World War I, everybody knows something about because you went to school, you learned about World War I at one point. And again, July 14th to November 11th, 1918, of which, of course, the United States had a very small fraction of that period of time. It was called the Great War, or the War to End All Wars. And much is written about the brutality, the logistics, the things that were involved with it. But much less is written about the home front. Because life affected here in the United States was affected just as much as it was, not as much as it was in Europe, but to a great deal. And it's oftentimes that story is overlooked. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. Now, one of the things we have is that when we talk about the battle itself in World War I, it was very complex. And correspondingly, the things that came out and what went into the war actually affected us here in Tippecanoe County. When we talk about the causes of World War I, root causes are still debated. It's a very complex situation. We know there's probably like five factors that went into it. One of the biggest ones is the fact that you have all these countries packed into a very small area, relatively speaking. And there were long simmering feuds that went back decades or centuries between many of these countries. And so what they did over time is they actually developed mutual defense treaties. For example, Russia and Serbia, now there's an unlikely pair, actually had a mutual defense treaty that said if somebody attacks Russia, Serbia is going to charge right in there and save Russia, and vice versa. Germany and Austria, of course, with their common background, Germanic background, formed a similar sort of pact. France and Russia had one, mostly because they were on opposite sides of Germany and Austria-Hungary, and so they formed a pact. And then Britain, France, and Belgium formed a mutual defense pact also. So you had literally all these dominoes tipped against each other so that if one particular one got into a scrape, the other would have to come in. Similar to what we have with NATO today, the concept behind that. Japan and Britain also had a pact too. And if one was attacked, the others would join in. Now, the second point was, on top of this, you had an increasing amount of imperialism going on. Meaning what? Meaning that these countries in Europe were moving out of Europe to places like Africa. This is a picture of Africa in 1913. All the colored areas are European colonies. The only part that's not are the small white areas right here and right here, and that's it. The rest were European colonies. The reason for demand was because the raw materials were in there, and the European countries saw this as a potential resource for becoming a leading industrial nation. Well, because of that, you had increasing competition for these resources. You had border disputes, and you had countries rubbing up against each other over in Africa, creating tension back home in Europe. The third component was militarism. In the early 1900s, Germany created the largest army in the world. And so from 1910 to 1900, 1910, Germany increased its militarism, which in response to that, the other countries took notice of it. Germany and Britain created the largest navies in the world. And on top of this, what was happening is within most of these countries, the military portion of their community and leadership was gaining the upper hand, becoming more influential in the politics that were driving the nation themselves. So you had these three things piled on top of each other, building up tension. Now, to throw this into the mix, you throw a little spice in the mix with nationalism, and the idea of national pride. And again, for an example, down here in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which were actually part of the Austrian-Hungary province, they wanted to break away and become part of Serbia. But of course, to have a country leave, or a province leave your country, was a no-no. And because it took away from your prestige and your nationalism with that. But because of this, for a period of about 10 years, 10 to 12 years, there was a growing tension between Serbia and Austria-Hungary, which will come into play in a minute here. So in the early 1900s, everybody in Europe wanted to be number one. Okay, we're number one because we're coming into this period of time when there's a great shift globally towards a more industrial complex driving the nation. And nations that had the ability to adapt to that were the ones who were viewed as having power in the global economy. Finally, here's the cause that we all were tested on in middle school as to what caused World War I. Now, I don't know about you, but when I took a history course and they told me this, I'm trying to figure out how some archduke in Austria attacked by a Serb from a country I had no idea where it was, Serbia, somehow created World War I. Well, this was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back without looking at the rest of the haystack that was involved with it. And as you can see, Austria or Europe during this period of time in the around 1910 was a tinderbox waiting to be ignited. What happened in June 1914 was a Serbian nationalist killed an Austrian archduke in Sarajevo. So Sarajevo is right here within the Austria-Hungary area, but within the Bosnian area that wanted to secede from Austria-Hungary. And so therefore, because this group that actually sent the assassins, there were actually 2 assassination attempts that day. The first one failed, the second one worked. Okay, this resulted in Austria declaring war on Serbia because they viewed this as a direct attack upon their nation from Serbia. And so boom, off we go. Well, remember, Russia and Serbia had a mutual defense contract, which basically meant that Russia is now in the game. So it is now at war with Austria-Hungary. And to come to its defense, Germany, of course, has a pact with Austria, so it comes into the war. And then Germany declares war on France, because you remember France and Russia had a pact, therefore they had to attack, or they had to declare war upon France. And to get to France, they went through Belgium, which triggered Belgium as part of this, which of course brought in Britain because they'd had a mutual defense pact with Belgium and France. Okay, everybody's playing now. Okay, so we now have a world war going on in Europe, all caused by one event down here in Sarajevo. Of course, everybody else joined in over the span of the next 15 months. And this, again, gave us World War I. And of course, at this point, the US declared neutrality, saying we're out of this. We are isolationists. We are staying out. This is not our problem. Therefore, they want to separate themselves quite a bit. Now, see, President Woodrow Wilson believed he represented the spirit. He firmly believed he embodied the spirit of the American person, the American citizen. And the American citizen at that time wanted isolationism. They didn't want any part of this. Okay. In fact, Wilson was reelected, as you remember, in 1916 on the pledge. He kept us out of the war. So in 1914 and 1916, life here in Tippecanoe County pretty much just went on like it always did. It didn't really wasn't affected by the war that much. However, slowly, US sentiment started to change during that period of time. One, the Americans reacted to stories coming out of Britain. Remember, Germany invaded France via Belgium. So doing, Belgium was pretty much neutral up to the point where the Germans came marching across the border. And so the thing that we saw and we heard about was the unarmed Belgians being, and they call it the rape of Belgium. Essentially, the Germans walking in and taking all the parts of that without any resistance, basically no resistance from the Belgians. This was fueled by stories that were printed by the Brits over in the United Kingdom. What they did is they sent an investigatory team to Belgium and interviewed people who had come from Belgium to get these stories about German atrocities. And it was published in the Alleged German Outrages, which was by Viscount Bryce, who had coordinated this. And this was the fodder that newspapers all over the world picked up and capitalized on. And frankly, Britain kind of wanted that to happen, because Britain was in this war and the United States was not. So the combination of images plus stories in the US paper, for example, this is the Des Moines Tribune, this is a picture out of one of the Indianapolis News, reinforces this idea that Germany was brutish. They were coming in and they were plundering Belgium, a defenseless country. But still, the European war was over there. It was on the other side of the Atlantic. And sentiment, even at this point up to 1915, was that there was little support in the United States to send US boys over there. We still believed in isolationism. However, given that, the European war did have benefits to the United States, including Tippecanoe County. The economy improved with neutral United States because we were supplying Britain and France with raw war materials. For example, between 1914 and 1917, US industrial production increased by 32% based upon the war alone, the war we were not in. So for example, Bethlehem Steel, plated armor, steel for making tanks that British were making, large artillery, ship plating, all those things came out of the United States and were shipped across seas. Akron rubber over in Akron, Ohio. Again, Army truck tires, gas masks, hose valves, and of course the barrage balloons and the blimps were all made in Akron, Ohio. Now, interesting enough, here locally, David Ross, who of course founded Ross Gear and Tool, declined an offer from Henry Ford to be the sole supplier of all steering gears for all Ford trucks and autos built during the war and the pre-war period. And he declined that. The reason being is, if you look into it, is that he did not want to hire a bunch of workers only to turn around at the end of the war and have to lay them off. So he actually decided that Ross Gear would continue on without taking in this particular deal, which is a real sweetheart deal. Still, Tippecanoe County benefited from this because even though we had small manufacturers here, they supplied the larger manufacturers. But there was something else going on here we need to be aware of that also played into this. Nationally, American businessmen like J.P. Morgan, we see here, had invested literally billions of dollars in loans to Britain and France. Loans to give them money so they could buy American industry products. Now, the bet here is that J.P. Morgan and others were that by supplying Britain and France with these materials, one, they get money into the factory so they can expand their industry. And two, at the end of the war, they can recoup on those loans that they made them. But if the Allies did not win, these billions of dollars in loan money to France and England would be lost. Therefore, many influential US businessmen were vested in the war's outcome already because they had literally $3 billion invested in the war outcome going to the Allies. So they put pressure on Wilson to actually enter the war. Meanwhile, in 1914-15, Britain's large navy was blockading Germany. Now, if you remember that map, you got France on one side, you got Russia on the other side, and Germany in the middle. Germany has no way of bringing in materials from either side, from the east to the west. And from the south, they have a lot of other countries, many of which are allies. They're not supporting Germany. So the only place they can really get supplies for the war is coming in from sea. So Britain decided to use their navy to blockade the German ports. Unfortunately, the Germans had the U-boats, the Untersee boat, or the undersea boat, submarines, that they then turned around not only to defend themselves, but also to put a blockade around Britain with the same idea that if they could strangulate Britain, they could win the war by cutting off Britain's supply. Of course, again, Britain was getting a lot of its materials from the United States. Multiple merchant ships were torpedoed and sunk by the German U-boats. And this is interesting, April of 1915, the German embassy placed ads in all major newspapers around the United States, advising them that Germany would be attacking any British or Allied flag passenger ships that were suspected of carrying war materials. In a short period of time, like 7 days later, the German U-boat torpedoed the Lusitania, a passenger ship off the coast of Ireland. Now, the thing about this is a little bit different, is that it was hit without warning. And this was unusual because what the U-boats would often do is when they would stop a ship, they would give them enough time to lower the lifeboats and get the crew off the ship before they torpedoed the ship. That was not the case with Lusitania. They sunk the boat and the ship went down in 20 minutes. For a luxury liner that size, that's incredible, which gave rise to a lot of speculation that perhaps there were munitions on board that exploded, causing the Lusitania to sink. Later, when they did find in the 1970s, when they did find Lusitania explored the wreck, they determined that such an explosion did not occur on Lusitania. That could be attributed to munitions. Over 1,000 passengers died, including 128 Americans. When this hit the press, it was headline news. And correspondingly, you can imagine that there was a large public outcry for Wilson to enter the war. But Wilson threatened to cut off relations with Germany. We still had them. But Germany said, okay, we'll back off. And we'll only do what we refer to as restricted submarine warfare. We will fire on Allied flagships only after we have given them a chance to lower the lifeboats and get the crews off. So based on that, Wilson resisted the calls to go to war in 1915 from Congress and his cabinet. So by 1915, we were still not in the war. A year later, in 1916, and 24 hours after announcing to the Allies German U-boats would resume unrestricted warfare, they did so, meaning attack any flagged vessel without warning and sink it. They sunk the British variants, often called the Sussex Contract. Now, the Germans knew that this would pull the United States into the war. They knew this would be enough to probably push Wilson to be able to enter the war. And they worried about that. However, their thinking was that it would take months for the United States to actually build up its industrial army complex, to actually get troops, to get their armies, to get their navies, and to get their industrial materials up and running. And in that period of time, with unrestricted U-boat activity, they would be able to choke off Britain and bring it into the war in Germany's favor. That was their gamble. Well, here in Lafayette, we were watching these things. We were seeing the stories. The Journal Courier, the Lafayette Journal and the Daily Courier ran U-boat accounts in great detail and stories of other things going on, including the trench warfare that was going on. Now, the stories they always wrote about the trench warfare was not the stalemate, but the fact that there had been great advances made, usually measured in hundreds of yards or less. But increasingly, sentiments started to change against the Germans in the community, as you can expect. Now, although not as prominent as they are in Indianapolis, we had a sizable contingent of Germans in our Lafayette community here. They were considered to be industrious and well incorporated into our community. For example, Thiemann Wagner, Ruger Bakery, John Lahr, the Dreyfus Meatpacking Company, Mohlhoff's, E.M. Schnabel Drugs, Schwab's Safe Lock and Key, all started by German immigrants who came over to the United States and settled in Tippecanoe County and were very successful and well incorporated into our community, obviously, since many of these places are still in business. German was taught in our schools regularly. German songs were part of the school curriculum. So again, the Germans were integrated into our community fairly thoroughly. And as a whole, the German community was loyal to the United States. Yes, they did publish some things in German-speaking newspapers that they had that were against some of the rhetoric was coming out against Germany. They did try to push back on that, but all in all, they were very loyal to the United States. Some churches, like St. Boniface, held German masses. They built the German National Park on the Wabash, 3 miles south of town. That was for the Germans to actually get together as families and have exercise and enjoy the outdoors. And there were German versions of service organizations like the International Order of Oddfellows had a German branch. And the Germans had their own club, the Deutsche Verein, which basically was the German club. Other anti-German sentiments were reported by the Lafayette Courier during this period of time. This is a little bit later on when the war actually started, that Indiana stamped out, quote unquote, stamped out teaching of German in public schools. But German families started changing names. For example, if your name was Wilhelm, you went by William. There was reports of smashing Victrola records that had German opera singers on. And then changing the name of sauerkraut to Liberty Cabbage, okay? However, for most part, most of Lafayette appeared to be supportive of the German community during that period of time. Then came January 1917. German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann, a name that will go down in history, sent a telegram to Mexico, a coded telegram that was intercepted by the Allies and translated. And what it said, it offered Mexico the promise that if they attacked the United States, that Germany, when they won the war, would give them back all the territory they lost in the 1848 Mexican-American War. That is, most of Texas and parts of New Mexico and Arizona. Well, this address, this particular thing, you'll notice that even though it was decoded in January 1917, the news came out March 1st, 1917. Wilson waited on this for a period of time because he knew when it came out, this will kind of be the final straw. Because one of the things people had always said, the reason for not going to war was the United States continent had not been attacked. This promised to attack the United States at home. So 2 days later, March 3rd, reflecting what he believed, Wilson believed was the spirit of American citizens, Wilson was willing to arm US ships, knowing that Germany would view this as an act of war. Well, Congress failed to follow suit. They decided not to do that. So what President Wilson did, he said, all right, Congress, you're not going to let me arm my ships. I'm going to do it anyway. And they called him back into session in April. On April 2nd, he asked the US Congress for a declaration of war, which they granted him. Now, here's an interesting foretelling. This is what Wilson stated. He wants the nation to exert all its power and resources to bring the government of Germany Empire and into the war. That will come back and hear us because, again, Wilson believed, he held a very strong belief that he was the spirit of the informed by the spirit and hope of people and even of God. That is a quote from him. He said, "I will not cry peace as long as there is sin and wrong in the world. America is born to exemplify that devotion to the elements of righteousness, which are derived from the revelations of Holy Scripture." These are all quotes from the President of the United States, who believed in his mind that this war was a crusade. Now, Wilson, because he did believe he embodied the U.S. spirit, the spirit of Americans, he was fearful of suppression of public discord against the war. So he wanted to suppress dissent against the war, because this was, in his mind, in a way, a holy war. In an address to Congress, he stated, this is a quote, "There are citizens of the United States, I blush to admit, who have poured the poison of disloyalty into the very arteries of national life. Such creatures of passion, disloyalty, and anarchy must be crushed out." He made his position very clear to Congress. At that point, he was able to push through the Espionage Act of 1917, which prohibited sharing any information that, quote, could be used for injury of the United States, a very broad sort of thing. Wilson also used the 1917 Espionage Act to give his Postmaster General the right to prohibit the moving of any, get Stephen admitted here, any periodical that was deemed unpatriotic or critical of the administration. And Burleson was an Old South politician. His family was strong in the Confederate Army. He was very much, as postmaster, he segregated the railway employers into colored and not colored. He engaged this, embraced the power, and barred any mailing of any cards or envelopes from any warring country. He required his postmasters to send him any material that he thought was seditious or possibly disloyal to the United States, so the senders could be censored or prosecuted. Using the Espionage Act, he barred 74 newspapers from conducting anything by mail. Basically just halted. And he halted the mail of any foreign language publications at all. So this was kind of the thought. Don't talk, the web is fun, they're listening to you. In addition to the 1917 Espionage Act, Wilson took it one step further and directly addressed the First Amendment, the freedom of speech. He pushed through the Sedition Act in 1918, making it illegal to, quote, incite disloyalty within the military or use any language that was disloyal to the government, the Constitution, the military, or the flag. Now, doesn't that sound something that goes against the First Amendment? Yet, the Supreme Court, violators could receive up to 20 years in prison. The Supreme Court upheld the Sedition Act by stating that it was a measure to defend against a clear and present danger and therefore justified. That is the world in which we entered in 1917. Wilson appointed Attorney General Thomas Gregory to work with Postmaster Burleson to, quote, crush domestic dissent. For example, the Attorney General required the Librarian of Congress send any name of a person who requested any set of books that were on his list that indicated disloyalty to the United States. He wanted to know the name. And this is a quote from Attorney General Thomas Gregory, which kind of reflects how things were going. "It is safe to say that the country has never been so thoroughly policed." And this actually was a take off, a shot off of a movie reel where this was his message that showed up on the movie reel before the movie in the movie picture houses. April 14, 1917, the Lafayette Journal reflected where we were militarily. The Germans were right. We didn't have an army. We had a very small army, 100,000, and the National Guard was 115,000. That was it. The Army wanted an army of more than 500,000. And after 6 weeks of heavily publicizing volunteer enlistment, only 73,000 men had volunteered. This triggered the Selective Service Act of 1917, which all males 21 to 30 must register for military service. And that age was actually extended up to 45 and later on to actually pull in people. In all, 2 million people volunteered. 2.8 million were drafted. So more than half the troops that were sent overseas were actually enlisted, conscripted. Wilson still worried that the draft might cause a problem with support of the war. Therefore, he employed George Creel, who was a well-known veteran of the newspaper industry, to be the official U.S. war propagandist. George Creel and his Committee on Public Information, that became one of the most important and powerful committees in the United States during the war, his actions affected Lafayette. His only goal was to light the, quote, light the fire of patriotism, nationalism, self-sacrifice, and support for the draft in the war at all costs. It isn't an army we must shape and train for war. It is a nation. So these are just some of the things that came out of Creel's sort of thing. Typical posters that he had, they actually produced motion pictures with that. And you'll notice an interesting thing. What do we got going on in the background? The Crusades. This was a crusade. So again, Second World War pictures. And then they started to get a little stronger with images that were meant to evoke a more emotional response, more of the us versus them mentality that was so necessary to ensure least amount of dissent. I like this one. Enlist. On which side of the window are you? This is not saying anything about a window. This is saying which side of the war are you on? And obviously the message is pretty clear. This is another one that was very popular. Daddy, what did you do in the Great War? And you see here the implication is this gentleman was not involved in the Great War. He's feeling very guilty having to explain it to his children. He got a little more graphic. Will you fight now or wait for this? Even the sheet music, which I've got several pieces over here, were designed to do this. This is a common theme. Mothers giving their boys to the war effort. So again, America, here's my boy. Lusitania went down, and even Paul Dresser, who wrote On the Banks of the Wabash, had his own song, Wrap Me in the Stars and Stripes. As you can see here, this is just some of the sheet music. And compared to World War II, the sheet music in World War I was clearly patriotic and driven by a lot of this propaganda that was coming out of the Committee on Public Information. So by fall 1917, the government controlled many aspects of our lives here in Lafayette. The war industry set allocated materials. It said what materials would go to what factories. They set the price for purchasing those materials. They set the price for selling those materials, and they set the wages for every individual in that factory. The fuel administration controlled where fuel would be distributed, and they were the ones who you can blame for daylight savings time, because they implemented that as a way to get people to drive less and to walk, bike, or use a horse more because daylight was longer, quote unquote longer. At least that was the idea. The Food Administration, one of the most powerful, controlled by Herbert Hoover, a future president, oversaw all agricultural production. In Indiana, we were especially hit by that. Corn was the commodity needed for the war. And so Indiana actually increased its production of corn 38% in the span of a year and a half. So George Creel's Committee on Public Information flooded newspapers with controlled press releases, poster images designed to incite patriotism, and this is probably more important, public condemnation of slackers, anarchists, revolutionaries, and draft dodgers. In other words, it wasn't just enough to do your part. You had to report people who were not doing it. The campaign was pervasive, quite effective. Creel also created the 4-Minute Men, and what they did is this was a group of 950 volunteers just here in the state of Indiana, but it amounted to about 200,000 across the United States, who would go to moving picture houses or theaters, stand up at the front and sing patriotic songs, lead the crowd in patriotic songs, and then give a 4-minute speech about the war and what it needed. At the ARC, the Orpheum and Strand Theaters here in downtown Lafayette, we had the best movies going available in the country. Why? Because they wanted people to go into the theaters where they could then talk about these topics. The Family Theater in Victoria had famous acts that normally would not come through Lafayette, but because we were between Indianapolis and Chicago, they stopped here. And when they did, people flocked in, and when they did, they heard the 4-Minute Men speeches. These speeches, again, emphasized not only patriotism, but community vigilantism. Now, I didn't add it in here, but there was a whole thing about the American Protective League that was created. They were deputized, 200,000 volunteers whose job was to seek out the slackers, the dissidents, the disloyals. and point them, turn them into the government. That was going on during this period of time in America. It doesn't necessarily sound like America, but that's what was going on during this war effort. The other thing was Americans must pay for the war. And this is where Liberty loans came in. And again, David had his medallion there that was a result of Boy Scouts doing Liberty loans or selling Liberty bonds. Citizens were expected to buy Liberty bonds and loans to support the war. And Creel's CPI program, propaganda machine, effectively instilled the message: if you're not doing that, you're not patriotic. Is this any more clear? Are you 100% American? Prove it. Buy government bonds. There's never a question in here. Well, usually not a question. It's usually simply a statement. You are to do this. And that's what this was designed to do. There were 4 Liberty bond campaigns in each community, and each community had a quota set by the government. While initial response here in Lafayette was a little bit slow, we met our quota for all 4 of those bonds with that. This is also a common tactic. Mr. Farmer, the government has paid the price of $2.20 on wheat. This assures you prosperity. You help the government buy Liberty bonds. We've helped you, you help us. There's an interesting picture, a cartoon is done by John McCutcheon, from local fame here. It shows a farmer and Uncle Sam's hand coming down and giving him potatoes. And then Uncle Sam's hand sitting there and saying, give back. The message was, give till it hurts. So again, the messages themselves, again, these are some of the things that we're promoting the Victory Liberty Loan. This one is really typical. It's very common here in Lafayette. The gentleman reaching into his overalls and pulling out whatever change he has in his pockets to give to the Liberty Loan. They then started to get a little more graphic. The message is very different here in these two, a lot darker. But as the Liberty Loan process went on, we saw the posters shift and become much more graphic. Okay. And even old Abe Martin got into it. Remember Abe Martin? Okay. Niles Turner, who don't believe in banks, spaded up $500 today and bought Liberty bonds. So everybody was part of this propaganda campaign to actually increase Liberty bonds, and they were successful. So how did Tippecanoe County respond to the governmental propaganda about the war? Well, according to Lafayette Journal-Courier, we demonstrate patriotic fervor with lofty goals. About 10,000 showed up for a parade a week after Wilson declared war. And the parade had all kinds of people in it, including the German club, who wanted to take that extra step to make sure that the community understand they were loyal to America. Purdue built a new armory in 1918. The old one burned down in 17. And they erected barracks east of Stewart Field there, which is over by where Hovde Hall is now. And they called that Camp Purdue. John Norberg's doing a write-up on that right now, putting together a book on that. Purdue is one of 157 total colleges that joined the trained troops in the Student Army Training Corps. What you see over here on the table is a panorama of one of the companies of Purdue, SATC. Purdue trained about 1,500 men, including auto mechanics and radio operators, and they developed 2 ambulance corps that saw action overseas, one in France and one in Italy, and were both given commendations for performance with that. Well, we go back here. Naval cadets were also trained on campus and housed directly next to the Army cadets. And Stewart Center, or Stewart Field, the football field, was the scene for numerous rumbles between the Army and the Navy with that, oftentimes having to be broken up and sometimes not broken up. Purdue co-eds, of which there were about 270 at the time the war broke out on campus, turned out hundreds of knitted sweaters and socks, and the Red Cross used them to bandages. So people were all involved. People had a role. The Red Cross, of course, geared up, and their job was to support services here in Tippecanoe County. They made bandages. They had the Red Cross canteen service. These are postcards that were given out to the soldiers as they came through on trains. The Red Cross Motor Corps, and they raised money for comfort items such as razors and so forth. They sent off to the troops. A lot of folks were involved with, later on they assisted with the flu, but a lot of folks were in organizations already in the community that participated. For example, the War Mothers organization. Our version, our Lafayette chapter of the DAR played a very large role in doing and contributing to the tasks of the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, the YWCA. And this is interesting. Dean Shoemaker, who happened to be in charge of the student of women, was in charge of the YWCA efforts in the war. Local churches and synagogues came together. here locally to do this. And all activities were paid by these members. Red Cross and these other organizations, other than a paltry amount of money that came to them, did not get funding for themselves. They raised thousands of dollars, all of which went to the war effort. They had to pay for everything out of their own pockets. So the Red Cross Campaign Service provided food, cigarettes for soldiers traveling to war. And there are numerous articles written about this, about how the soldiers really appreciated that. Anytime a train was due to stop in Lafayette, a telegram was received to mobilize the canteen. And for example, on this one, this is interesting, came by a night letter, so it came in at night. Message to the campaign chairman, but tells them what was coming. 2 tourists, I meant 2 passenger train cars, 1 hospital car, 70 patients with their attendants, and 2 litters. Litters were people who were amputees coming back from the war. They were headed for Fort Dodge. So when you saw litter, you knew they were amputees. It goes on to describe another one. It's going to Fort Grant. This one down here, 1 tourist hospital car, 53 patients, attendants, 1 insane litter. Fort Sheridan, headed to Fort Sheridan. Insane was the term they gave for shell-shocked individuals returning from the war. That's what referred to them as insane. How it goes. And because this was a litter insane, this was an amputee. So again, telling them what type of people were going to be on the train. This is a typical train, hospital train with individuals that, and the Red Cross would go in, comfort these folks, bring them in cigarettes, things to drink, etc. The Red Cross Motor Corps was actually formed later in the war effort. It consisted of women who volunteered to use their car and the car transported servicemen and officers. And during the influenza outbreak, they transported people from the Camp Purdue to the hospital itself. Although for doing this, for using a car, you were subject to a military drill once a week, and you were given a free course in auto mechanics at Purdue University. Sign me up, okay. For those that were not involved with the Red Cross, the quote unquote women at home or the women of the house, the message was food is a weapon against the Hun, food is ammunition for the troops. Every piece of food eaten in the house is less food for our troops and therefore conserve. I'm as patriotic as can be. There was Meatless Tuesday nationwide. You couldn't buy meat, period. And this was posted in just about every grocery store. You replaced the use of beef and pork with fish and vegetables. Beef and pork went to the soldiers. You replaced wheat with corn, oats, and barley and other types of grains. You cooked with olive oil and cottonseed instead of butter, because butter went to the troops. And then you replace sugar with syrups and fresh fruit. And notice something here. At the beginning of the war, Americans ate on average 85 pounds of sugar per year per person, compared to Britain, 40, French, 37 pounds, German, 20. We were already sugar addicted by World War I, okay? So this was quite a thing when they limited us to 2 cups of sugar, or excuse me, 2 pounds of sugar per week in a household. All right, potatoes were encouraged to be eaten at home. Now that doesn't make any sense because you've always heard stories about KP was peeling potatoes, right? Kitchen police, peeling potatoes. No, they were too heavy to be feasible to ship overseas. So we ate them here. By World War II, they figured out a way to dehydrate the potatoes and be able to ship them. Emphasis was on zero food waste. Wasting 1 slice of bread per person amounted to 875,000 pounds of wasted flour. And the government flooded newspapers with meatless recipes, including corn, which of course Indiana was a very good source for. And they advocated nose to tail eating, all parts of the animal, from the snout, the tongue, the heart, liver, everything. Don't waste a bit. So, in answer to the question, Tippecanoe County did support the war. They did very well, okay? And then something happened. Last week of February, 1918, Haskell County, Kansas. Someone carried an unusual form of flu from Haskell County to Fort Funston in Kansas. Within 3 weeks, 1,100 troops were sick enough with the flu to be hospitalized. Now, the thing is, the incubation period for flu runs anywhere from 2 days to 5 days or longer. So unfortunately, before others showed illness, many of them were shipped off to other camps and to troop ships to France. The result was a first wave of a flu epidemic that passed through the United States and over to Europe. It was, even though it spread more quickly, it was not really any more deadly than a typical flu. Okay, when troops in France got a good case of epidemic of late grip, and the Germans got it too. In fact, several campaigns in German and the French were canceled because their troops were so sick with the flu. News of the flu was suppressed in American, British, and French newspapers for fear of morale, and in the US for sedition activity. Anything that interfered with the war or supported the war was considered sedition. If you read through newspapers, you do not find the word influenza, except in reference to Spain. Spain was neutral, and it had no press censorship. So it published about the flu that was going through the country there in Spain, including, especially when their king Ferdinand fell seriously ill with the flu. And this was the news that got back to the United States, hence the moniker Spanish flu. It was the flu in Spain and Spanish flu, even though it was occurring everywhere else. So that's where the name comes from. So the flu deaths, though, for that first wave were less than measles in Europe throughout the summer of 1918. There was one little report by the Army and by a physician in Chicago of a kind of unusual manifestation of the flu that would be kind of precedent for what was going to happen later, causing a wet hemorrhagic lungs choked with blood, and being fatal within 24 to 48 hours of clinical signs. But they were minor. They were not noted. They were just kind of a thing, because flu overall was going down to the point where in the summer of 1918, the British declared the epidemic over. So the cases dropped in Europe and US, but did not totally disappear. They just kind of went underground. And then a British ship docked in Philadelphia in July 1918, full of very sick sailors from Europe. Signs included nosebleeds, which are not something you typically see with flu. And so the ship was quarantined successfully, and no one outside the ship was sick. They dodged a bullet in that port, but it would come back. But unfortunately, this continued on. Through August 1918, we're now getting towards the end of the war. Ships from Europe began arriving with flu patients on board. In fact, there were enough flu cases on board that oftentimes ships reported burying people at sea in the transit over that died from the flu. This flu was more deadly. And ships that were quarantined upon arrival, all ships were quarantined upon arrival in Boston. Now, Boston's kind of an interesting place, because just up the road from it is Fort Devens, one of the largest Army cantonment bases in the United States. They had 45,000 men. Capacity was 36,000. On September 1st, 1918, 4 soldiers were diagnosed with pneumonia, not flu, but pneumonia. Within 3 weeks, 1,500 Fort Devens soldiers reported ill with pneumonia every day. 4 to 1,500 in 3 weeks. This flu was different. It's described. 2 hours after admission, mahogany, dark purplish spots would appear on the face, indicating cyanosis, an ability to get oxygen in. Rapid progression went to a bloody, frothing, gasping death within a few hours. Many of these soldiers died within 24 hours of the first signs showing up. This was something different than they saw before. This wave of flu was the deadly flu that we associate with the Spanish flu. September 7th. By September 7th, 300 sailors from Boston shipyards arrived in Philadelphia. Remember, we just said Boston was a hot spot. Well, these sailors, when they left Boston, were fine. They felt okay. But the outbreak in the Philadelphia shipyards was predictable, but Philadelphia's public health director said the flu in the shipyards posed no threat to the city. By mid-September, 1,000 in Boston, back in Boston, had died. In Philadelphia, hundreds of sailors were sick in the Navy yards down there in Boston, or in Philadelphia. But in the city itself, there were very few cases. Therefore, officials were focused only on keeping the public calm, despite strong advice from experts to ban public gatherings. They didn't do so. They refused to listen to them. Officials feared that causing a panic would interfere with the war effort. And of course, that is a seditious act. In fact, when you read the papers, one of the advice from the government in the papers is simply, if you don't worry about the flu, don't panic. That was the advice that they were given. In Philadelphia, the board held advice, well, stay warm, keep your feet dry, and your bowels open. Well, Philadelphia had a problem. It had a quota for its last Liberty Bond, or its third Liberty Bond. And it was behind. And it had planned a parade in September 28th that was central to being successful in this. The doctors and the University of Pennsylvania experts said, you've got to cancel the public event. You've got to cancel the parade. They were ignored. So they turned to the newspapers and they said, you've got to publish that the flu is going to be here and you've got to cancel the parade, or you've got to put pressure to cancel the parade. Nobody would print the stories. Again, there'd be anti-seditions against the war. But now, 1,400 sailors were hospitalized in the Navy yards in Philadelphia, and the number was going up. But there was still no lockdown. Soldiers and sailors could move freely about Philadelphia, mix with the population, and incubating and spreading the infection. The day before Liberty Bond Parade, suddenly there were 123 civilians, not military, that were hospitalized for influenza in Philadelphia. This was the tip of the iceberg. The public health director, knowing this, decreed that the Liberty Bond Parade and the rallies would go on as planned. No newspapers printed any caution about the flu or questioned Cruzen's decision to proceed. And what you see here is people, 100,000 citizens, shoulder to shoulder, watching this 2-mile-long parade. 2 days after the parade, Cruzen, the public health director, said, we have the flu in the city. We had it the day before the parade, but now he said, we officially have the flu in the city. 3 days after the parade, every bed in the hospitals, 31 hospitals, were filled. 3 days after the parade, 117 people died, not were ill, died in a single day. 4 days later, 254, 289 the next day, 315, 428. You can see that is not a linear progression. That is an exponential progression. And that's the way this flu worked. Within a matter of about 10 days, the numbers would climb to over 1,000 deaths a day. The hospitals were overwhelmed. Bodies were stacked like cordwood in hospital corridors. Mortuaries could not handle them, and people were not able to be buried. The city basically was paralyzed with the stench of death. Meanwhile, back in Lafayette, in October, should be right after this period of time, John Hurdy of the State Board of Health warned the flu was highly contagious, but quarantine's impractical, so don't bother to do it. 1 week later, he advised that all we got to do is got to get rid of all the spitters. If everybody would stop spitting and sneezing and coughing, we would get rid of the flu. Purdue canceled classes October 11th. They resumed them. They were going to resume them at the end of October. They ended up going until November. Lafayette held a bond parade in October despite the ban on public meetings. And eventually 300 Purdue students did contract the flu. 11 of them died. In Lafayette, our deaths ran like this. In September, we had 22. October was our peak, 44. November 5th, in November, there were 5. It almost disappeared. But the third wave came in December, and there were 35 deaths. So again, we had 3 waves to this flu that came through. Our death rate here in Lafayette was 4.9 out of 1,000. We were 8th in the state for the 8th highest death rate here in Tippecanoe County. So just to look at the war itself, this is taken from the Gold Star, people who were Tippecanoe County residents who died in World War I. The number that were killed in action was 14 from this county. Those who were killed in accident, aeronautic accident, railroad accident, was 4. TB gas. Now this is interesting because again, they would often diagnose those that had been gassed with chlorine gas, for example, would get lungs that were consolidated, just thickened. And it actually diagnosed them as TB, even though they weren't. And then another group that just died of disease. Some of these were POWs, a lot of people that they did not know what disease they died from, but you can bet some of these were the flu. And then others, which was 3. We had one guy who went down the ship that was sunk, another that died from food poisoning, and a third that was shot by a fellow unruly soldier in Germany. And then pneumonia or flu, that's where the majority of our deaths occurred. It was not from killed in action. In fact, only 14 died from killed in action, but 40 died from all other causes, the majority of which were the disease. The flu was deadlier in Tippecanoe County than the war itself, including Sister M Camilla, who was the one female listed in our Gold Star with that. She was a nurse at St. B's who took care of the Camp Purdue influenza cases. Unfortunately, contracted influenza and died at the end of November. She's 46 years old. She was buried with full military honors because she was considered to be an auxiliary army nurse. Well, the war ended November 11th, 1918. Monon engine came charging through 5th Street, bells clanging before dawn to announce the news with that. 2 parades formed, everybody marched through on both sides of the river and turned out. But you have to remember, the armistice was only the beginning of the end of it. Our troops had to stay in Germany and occupy Germany until after the Treaty of Versailles was signed and implemented. So we actually had troops returning all through the end of 1918 after the war had ended through 1919. And on one of those particular occasions, an interesting thing happened. Now, this is a report of the Lafayette Democrat and also in the Purdue Exponent, where you have this gentleman here. It says, "On the levee with our hero." What's that all about? Well, in 1919 Welcome Home down in Indianapolis for returning troops, there was a member among them. There was a Purdue student who had never served in the Army, but was listed or shown or walking among the ranks of the returning officers. His name was H.T. Weinshack. He was recognized by other Purdue students attending that rally because he was wearing an Army uniform with service stripes indicating he had been in the war, and an artillery signet indicating, and he was leading a company of artillerymen. And these Purdue students say, "That's not right. We know this guy." And the reason they know him is because he had previously been arrested for impersonating an officer at Camp Purdue in 1918. He was jailed and then released with a warning, which he obviously disregarded. After Weinshack returned from Purdue from that Indianapolis rally, students took matters into their own hands. As you can tell, they formed a cadre basically of people. He's got a chain attached to him. He's got in this case, a pickle stick helmet like the Germans had. "Our hero" is written on his chest, and he's taking a walk. He was chained and marched from West Lafayette to the county courthouse and made to publicly apologize to a large gathering crowd. And vigilantism was still alive in some ways, even into 1919. This was not tolerated. Weinshack never returned to Purdue University after that. Okay? But the Great War changed everything about him, throughout the world. It rewrote global treaties. It hastened the Russian Revolution. It mechanized war forever. It moved the U.S. from the isolationists to the center of the world stage. It solved the problems of the 19th century while creating a whole new set of problems for the 20th. After all, it was the war to end all wars. Thanks for your attention.